So I have Illustrator open, and I'm going to create just a new file. I want to go over a little bit more about how it's actually working. I showed a few bits last time, but not very much. I mostly explained the workspace. So if I just add some squares, right, and then if I save this as an SVG file, we can see the code that it's using to make this. So here we see these rectangles, right, which correspond to the ones that I have on the canvas or on the artboard. They have a class, right, and they have some x and y coordinates, which defines the position, width and height, which basically decides how far they extend from that starting point. And this class is sort of their style, what gives them like their color or the color of their stroke or how thick the stroke is around the shape, etc. And so these are both referring to this ST0 style, which in the code is right here. So if I start to change some of these attributes, if I change this and I give it a color, and maybe I go into properties and increase the thickness of the stroke, that will start to add more attributes in here. So if I save this and I reopen that text file, now you can see here the rectangle itself is pretty much the same. The only difference is now we have two different classes, one for ST1 style 1 and one for style 0, and these correspond up here again, right? So style 1 looks to be the same as what style 0 was before. It's all S for the fill, which is white, all zeros for the stroke, which is black, but the other one has a bunch more stuff, right? So this is basically what Illustrator is doing. It's storing this information as data, which is why with this type of artwork, not only is it easier to edit because it just puts in more attributes, it also means that we can zoom in as many times as we want, and the graphics will never get like pixelated like a photograph or like pixel-based art, right? No matter how many times we zoom in, it remains perfectly sharp because it is just redrawing from the data. Oh, I've lost it. Anyway, we are at 51,000% of the image's actual size, and we don't see any pixels still. And I could zoom in even closer if I didn't keep getting lost because of how far in we're zooming. So it stays perfectly sharp and perfectly pristine and no pixelation because it's all being drawn from this data as opposed to just pixels. So I'll zoom out by pressing Command 0. I was zooming in by pressing Command plus. You can zoom out by pressing Command minus, or you can press Command 0 to like fill the screen with the graphic. Now, if I click on this, right, we see this line here. This is a path, and we see these anchors, right, and these let us move it. If I switch to the white arrow, now you can see these anchors, and you can also see this here. This is not actually data for the square itself. This allows me to edit part of the shape, and that's part of Illustrator. But these points here, these points are part of the shape, and if I click one, I can move it, right? And that changes the shape because the lines are connecting those points. And then if I save it and I reload this, this will look a little different now because it's no longer a rectangle. I've changed this to some sort of polygon. And if I open it, you can see here in the code that's exactly what Illustrator did as well. It changed the rectangle to a polygon to match the change that I just made. So pretty much everything that you're doing here is object-based. And that being said, that can make things a little confusing because of how used to pixel type graphics we are. A lot of times people want to create like a background, or rather they think there already is a background and they want to color it. There's not really a paint bucket in this set of tools, but there is in the Essentials Classic. And people often in the older version would find sort of this paint bucket, and they would want to color the background, and they wouldn't understand why it wasn't working. But when we looked at the code for this file, there is no background, right? We have one polygon, we have one rectangle, we have styles for the two of those, but there's not an object for the background. And so when we're trying to use this paint bucket to color the background, there's no object there. Then we can go in and actually color things with this because we have an object for it to color. So that is something that some people have a bit of confusion with. It takes them a little while to wrap their head around. This space here, where we can work, is not a canvas, it's just a space. And unless you actually put an object there, like a big giant square, you have nothing to color. So if you want a background, typically you just make a big giant square and you send it behind everything else. Right click, arrange, send it back, and then you can color this whatever color you want. The other way to do it is when you're saving, you can decide then if you want the background to be transparent or white or black or a specific color. Kind of two different ways. I like to actually just make the backgrounds with the big giant square sent to back, because then I can actually see how my work looks as I'm working on it, as opposed to just trying to imagine it and then seeing after I'm done if it actually looked the way I thought it would. Now the other thing about this is when people erase, they often don't quite understand the way that Illustrator works either. They think, okay, so I want to erase part of this shape, right? And so I'm going to grab my eraser and I'll erase, right? And that's kind of small. Maybe I can make my brush bigger. But you've already seen what's happened there, right? So when we erase, it's not it's not erasing the green, right? I mean, it is, but then it comes back. So keep in mind that this is an object, and this object has a fill and a stroke, right? And so when we erase, what we're actually doing is we're carving out part of the object. The object still has a fill and it still has a stroke. We've just actually changed the boundaries, the borders, where the borders of this object are. So if we save this now and I reopen this file as text, you can see that my object has changed a bunch actually. We have this rectangle here. This is still that same rectangle, right? But now our polygon is not a polygon, and instead we have quite a big mess here that consists of two different paths. One path here, one path here, and that's these two different parts. So it still has all these different points, and it still has a fill and a stroke. We can't really erase the way that you might be thinking. If we want to erase part of the stroke, that's a little bit hard to do, and instead we actually have to use this white arrow, and we can click on the points that we want to delete. But keep in mind that those points are also defining the fill. So I might want to only erase the stroke, but I'm also erasing the fill at the same time because those points define where that fill goes. So it makes things a little bit interesting.